This is Event Masters. Behind the scenes stories, experiences, and lessons shared by the world's leading event experts. Hosted by Christian Napier.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Event Masters. I am Christian Napier, and I am super stoked for our next guest, Chris Crowley, who is joining us today from Park City. Chris, how you doing?
Greetings, and thank you.
For those of you who don't know who Chris Crowley is, for one of the 5 people on Earth who don't know him yet, Chris, he's been in events for a long time. He actually got started as an intern with the when he was at San Francisco. What is it? San Francisco Convention Facilities.
Correct.
And
the
there was a big
Moscone
earthquake.
Center and Moscone Center.
We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that earthquake in a second.
Great.
And that kind of got you into this business. I met you when you worked at Salt Lake 2002, the Salt Lake 2002 Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games. But before that, you worked Sydney. Since then, you worked Vancouver, you worked Rio, and tons of other events. Too many to list here, because if we listed them all, that's all we would be doing. We'll be listing all the events that you worked on. Anything from conventions, trade shows, concerts, festivals, sport events, political events, community events. Oh, and then there's this little thing, this thing that happened in 2020 that rhymes with Rovid, that you've been dealing with in a unique capacity. We'll get into that as well. Chris Crowley is currently serving as the emergency manager of public health for the Summit County Health Department here in the state of Utah. And Chris, we're delighted, and I'm so thrilled to have you joining us to share your stories today.
Thanks, Christian. I'm happy to be here. And, on the last visit we had, I think that was a successful podcast as well. So looking forward to another one.
Well, I'm looking forward to it as well. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about this role that you're in, being an emergency manager, public health up there in Summit County. It's kept you very busy the last few years, this whole crazy COVID pandemic.
Yeah, that's the truth. And I guess I'm going to dip a little bit into my past and into my current and future, I guess. I had a really peculiar beginning in the event world in that I got an internship to work at the Moscone Convention Center in San Francisco. And I started, and just a few months later, we had a huge earthquake, 7.0 in the city. And, we were hosting a convention, water pollution control, with about 30,000 people. And we went from this very sort of well choreographed, planned event into complete and utter natural disaster chaos. And this was my first sort of introduction to events and into disasters, and literally those two I consider them parallel courses, because what happened was I learned how to do event planning, and I learned how to do event management. And over the years, I've gone through and gone to school and gotten my certifications and such. And I found that these two things go hand in hand all the time. And it's really worked out quite well, and certainly helped me not only on the Olympic and big event planning piece, but also for the pandemic and serving as the emergency manager for the health department here. As we tried to put together our plans to respond to the pandemic, I realized that Olympic planning or big event planning is exactly the same as planning for a health disaster, and I did exactly what we do in our organizing committees. I compartmentalized the elements. We established our goals, of course, compartmentalized who was going to do what, where, when, how. Started creating schedules and operational plans around that. Then we integrate everybody into a venue team, if you will, although the venue is a disaster. And then we deliver upon those expectations, just like we would do for an event or for the Olympic Games. We had test events. where we literally tested people, or we did some smaller vaccination clinics. But then ultimately we launched and invited people to come to our vaccination clinic here in Summit County, and it worked. I mean, I brought in the architects that we used during the Salt Lake 2002 games, and we drew venues using the same templates as we used for the 2002 and subsequent Olympic planning. It worked out great. It was a rewarding experience for me. Certainly, it seems odd to say that because pandemic COVID wasn't necessarily rewarding from the standpoint of medals and cheering, but it was rewarding from the event standpoint, and the fact that I was able to use the skills that I had, develop these plans to serve our community, and we did just that. And we ended up sort of patting myself on the back here. We were the most efficient clinic operations and response in Utah, and we exceeded the clinics and the counties that were far larger than Summit County. And that's a great feeling for somebody who plans events for a living.
All right. Well, I want to dig into this a little bit more and the parallels and the differences between the earthquake, which many people outside of the Bay Area may recall from, if I remember correctly, the World Series was going on at that time, was it not?
It was
over across the bay, and so and it had massive impacts, not just on that venue, but all the really that entire Bay Area was impacted there. But the thing is, with an earthquake, it happens. There may be aftershocks, but there's been a history of earthquakes, and we have some knowledge about how to deal with them. This pandemic thing was a bit strange in that, okay, it comes, we think, when it's not going to be a problem. Oh, it got here. Okay, we're shutting things down. We're going to shut down for a week or two, and then we'll come out and life will slowly go back to normal. And that's not exactly what happened.
Right.
So I'm curious how you dealt with the uncertainty, because you come into this early on. Your event planning is fantastic, but with an event, okay, well, it has to be delivered by such and such a date. With this pandemic thing, the information was not complete and the situation kept evolving over time. So how did you continue to be proactive while at the same time being reactive when you had new information coming in? You had to update your plans.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good question, because what happened was I was actually hired by the Summit County Health Department to write a pandemic plan and a plan for use of the federal strategic national stockpile. And those plans were very similar to Olympic venue and operational planning. And I really, like I said earlier, I took that experience I had from the Olympics to write those initial plans. The idea behind any plan, even and especially if we're talking about events, is that we have to be prepared for changes. We have to be prepared for contingencies. And I know that there's a lot of discussion around contingency planning, but the fact of the matter is that contingency planning is the plan. And if you don't expect something to change, you're not in the right business, and you're certainly going to be surprised needlessly, I will say. So anyway, in 2010 and 2011, I wrote these pandemic plans. And by the time, we got grant money to support them and to build up our capabilities and training around that. And then when the pandemic rolled around, we had a foundation plan to work from. So we knew the basics of pandemic response because we had already participated in H1N1 and a number of lower level um, uh, pandemics, and I don't mean to uh, take away from the severity of things like H1N1. People died, and it's very unfortunate, of course. But we had this foundation plan to work from. And then ultimately, what I did with our plans was I went through, and we have with a pandemic, it's not like an earthquake. The earthquake happens and you're immediately engaged and you have to start opening shelters. And that's really what we did in San Francisco at the convention center. We opened up this shelter immediately for 5,000 people. They stayed with us for a week, and until other arrangements could be made, and the city could begin the recovery process. With the pandemic, we have a little bit more lead time. We know that there's lead time. Even if the vaccine was available, there's still space that gives you the opportunity to gather your teams together, to start making assignments, and to really look deeply into those plans and understand what's changed. Who are the populations that are the most vulnerable? What kind of resources and training are we going to need, and how will we ultimately deliver this? Um, the lead time for developing a new vaccine, it was, roughly a year to 2 years to 3 years to a big question mark. But it did give us this sort of ability to start. And as we started, I put together our teams. We started to divvy up the responsibilities based on, what people's specialties were or what partner organizations could provide what. And we did, in fact, get this. We had a couple of opportunities to test our systems in that the COVID tests became available much earlier, obviously, than the vaccine itself. And what I did with the COVID tests was gather up a big stockpile of tests, and then we went out and had COVID testing events where we invited the public in different areas to come in, and we basically ran it the same as we would with the vaccination clinic. And quite frankly, it was very similar to an Olympic event where people are in a location, then they need to get transported to the venue, they need to enter the venue, watch the event, or get a test or a shot, and then they leave the venue, and hopefully we're done after that. So again, that gave us this ability to create some smaller scale test events, go back and sort of tweak our plans and reinvent some of those wheels, and then ultimately deliver once the vaccine once the vaccine was available, and we were able to actually bring the community in by priority group and deliver the vaccines as necessary.
Well, it was a tremendous effort, and congratulations. You mentioned that the county performed, I don't remember what the specific measures were, but it performed admirably well here in the state of Utah, compared to the other counties. And so congratulations on delivering that.
So,
and as you
Christian,
mentioned,
if I can actually interrupt there, the county was absolutely instrumental, and they were supportive of the entire effort, but we would not have been as successful as we were if it weren't for the volunteers. And our volunteer base was phenomenal. The community came out in droves to help in every way imaginable. And it did give me sort of the goosebumps thinking back about how the volunteers in Salt Lake really stepped up to the plate at the Salt Lake Olympics, and they were the ones who really, they did the heavy lifting for us, right? We take the credit, but they did the heavy lifting, and the same is true for our pandemic effort. So I felt really comfortable, even though I'm not a medical professional, so to speak. I'm a public health professional, but I felt really comfortable with being able to do the job that I was tasked with, to lead this uh, pandemic response, because I had done it before.
Well, let's talk about the process that you went through to build this foundation, because as you mentioned, really uh, over the past 30 years, you acquired the skills and experience that you needed
Yeah.
to help the county get through a very, very difficult time. So it all starts with this huge earthquake. You're an intern.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing this earthquake thing. So, uh, uh, going back even before then, what was it that inspired you or motivated you or intrigued you about, hey, I want to intern for at the Moscone Convention Center, because you can intern for a lot of things.
Yeah.
So did you already have some interest or experience in events that led you to do this internship, which then as you said, kind of hooked you in,
Mm-hmm.
in this crazy industry that we're working in?
Um, this is going to sound kind of sad, but it was a paid internship. That was my hook. And I was a carpenter most of my young life, and all the way up until that time. And I knew at some point I needed to get into some level of business, not just swinging a hammer and digging holes. So I just went to our internship department at San Francisco State University, and they laid out a couple of different opportunities for me. One of them happened to be at Moscone, and I signed up for it. I went in for an interview. I thought it was a okay interview, but then I didn't hear back. I didn't hear back from anyone. And so I just chalked that up to, oh well, I didn't have any experience anyway. About a month later, I get a call. I'd been out with my friends all night, and I get a call at like 7 o'clock in the morning from this guy, and he says, "Hey, how you doing?" He's screaming on the phone, and I like, who is this, and why are you calling me? And I used a couple of choice words in there that I'll skip for this podcast, but he said, the guy on the phone says, "Oh, so I guess you don't want to work at the Moscone Center no more." And I'm like, "No, no, 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 I do, I do, I do." And he says, "Great, I'll see you Monday." And he hangs up. And this was the guy that who was eventually my boss. And I showed up on Monday. I don't even think I owned a tie at that time. I show up in my bright, shiny little tie, and I said, "Hey, I'm here." And nobody knew he had hired me, and he went on vacation for 2 weeks. so So they didn't know what to do with me. Then the housekeeping manager walked by and he said, "I'll take him." And I literally spent my first 2 weeks at the convention center learning from the bottom up. And it was a fantastic education because I understand now how to clean large and small spaces, how crews operate, how the communication at that lowest level really transpires, and a lot of the other work that me as a fancy college graduate, I probably wouldn't have been interested in getting into that kind of depth, but I did. And to this day, I'm thankful for that moment where I got hired and David, my boss, went on vacation. And it really it did inspire me. Again, I started at the bottom, learned and ultimately became the director of events there, and then suddenly a call out of the blue to come to the Olympics, which I think
All
in the
right.
event world is kind of, that you're meeting the
This is
pinnacle.
this is absolutely crazy, because your career could have gone across the spectrum. You could still be swinging a hammer. You could have been doing something completely different. It just happened that the wheel of fortune spun to Moscone. You're like, okay, well, let's try that one. And then you get hired. So you mentioned that you eventually became the director of events there. So how did you go from being paid intern person to actually staying on, becoming a permanent staff hire, and then eventually becoming the director of events?
Yeah. Um, you know, I became hooked immediately, right? I even during the interview, I thought, wow, this is an amazing world that I never knew about. Seeing these events come in and out, and I mean, massive events with millions of pounds of freight coming in 3 days, having a show for 3 or 4 days, and then out in two, and then the other one comes in right on the tail of it. So I knew that I liked that, and I liked the planning aspect. I had really only done construction planning up until that point. But one of the things that I realized was there's so much information flowing through the convention center, and so many different scenarios and fires that need to be put out, and you know people who are he said, she said, what about this, what about that. And the first thing I started doing was hoarding information. So if you wanted to know technical specs on something, I had it, right? Go talk to the intern. And if you wanted to know about the floor loads, or what was inside of the electrical boxes, or what was how much time did it take for a show with 1.7 million pounds of freight to come in or come out, I started collecting that data. And what that did was start to shape my perspective on planning and scheduling and creating time and motion, and understanding what it was going to take for us to accomplish any given event, no matter how technical it was. And so I guess I started to make myself invaluable. My internship ended, and nobody told me to leave, so I didn't. And I literally worked, I was an intern, I guess, for 11 years, because nobody told me to leave, and nobody told me my internship was over. Um, but from there, I, I got an opportunity to lead a couple of the different labor crews at the convention center. So that gave me this, introduction to real leadership and responsibilities that, not just to get the work done, but to the crew who are getting the work done, and how to interact with them to either support the efforts that they're putting forth, or to manage the challenges of being human. And those were some of those really important lessons that I learned along the way. And from there, I just continued climbing the ladder, eventually becoming an event manager to help out, to plan with clients, and then the director of the facility, which was an executive level job, which I loved it. And I had a fantastic boss who was my mentor. And when I ultimately went to the games, I took all those lessons that I had learned at the Moscone Center and applied them. And of course, I had to be open minded and reshape the way I thought about events, because I was going from a provider's perspective to an event owner's perspective at the games. But I had a very well-rounded education, and to this day I still apply those lessons that I learned on my first day following the housekeeping manager around.
You mentioned that your boss was your mentor, and I like to ask people about mentors because I think mentors are so important. And so, what was it about him that made him a mentor, and what were some of the stories or the lessons that you learned from him that helped shape your career
Mm-hmm.
since then?
I think first and foremost was just confidence and trust. Like he told me, here's a project, and he didn't know whether I had the actual capabilities. He just assumed that you went to college, you should be a smart guy. Here is we were expanding the convention center at that time. So one of my projects was going through and establishing how much FF&E we needed, furniture, fixtures, and equipment, right? All of the temporary furnishings that we need to set a ballroom, for instance, that's 5,000 square feet. That's a lot of equipment. And the challenge that we have in San Francisco, of course, is that everything is compact and everybody is basically living and working on top of each other. So storage is almost non-existent. So our first challenge was get enough furniture to set, classroom and theater rooms in a breakout facility of 56 meeting rooms, and then have the flexibility to then open that space up into one big room and not have that equipment in there, but it has to go somewhere. So those are like these little intricacies that I don't think people quite understand, is that just because a facility has 10,000 chairs, they don't always have them on site because they don't have storage, and it's not feasible for us to go pick them up at a warehouse and drive them out, and then 2 days later do that same thing, and then 2 days after that do it again. So those kinds of lessons, a lot of it was trial by fire. I'll be perfectly honest about it, but he trusted me, and when I would present my plan for whatever it was, or maybe I was looking through some budget elements, he let me run with it. And a lot of times it was sink or swim, and I will say I sunk a couple of times. There's no question about it. But again, if you're open-minded and you're willing to learn, even a failure can be helpful in that, you learn, I probably don't want to do that the next time.
All right,
I think
I have to ask, do you have any specific examples? They couldn't have been massive failures, right? Because I mean, then the guy wouldn't trust you, and you'd be like, you're out of a job, or so. But okay, yeah, maybe there was some mistakes made, or something happened, but you were able to recover from those. But what was one of those times where it didn't work out, but you learned something, and you said, okay, well, the next time we do this, we're gonna handle it differently.
I might be reaching a little bit, but I think this is it's an interesting and somewhat entertaining story. So here I am, new guy, and I'm suddenly, I have this crew of people that are responsible for, basically it's called the event detailing, where we clean all of the convention the night before to make sure everything is shiny and all the booths are ready to go for the big grand opening that next day. And so I had a crew of, I want to say there were anywhere from 30 to 40 people at any given time. And I had this great idea. I'm going to work with one of the rehabilitation organizations in the city of San Francisco, and I'm going to take people who are coming out of prison, and they're going to get these jobs, and they're going to learn how to ultimately to work their way up to becoming like the operations crew or work in our food and beverage department, but they're literally getting that chance. And so I bring in all these people, and it's working pretty good. At least I think so. And then I come across a couple of like oddities, and I realize that there's a fair number of people who can't read, and so I think, well, I need to, how can I help that? Because we hand a plan and tell people to do something, and we had people who were just doing all the work that we had ever done over and over and over again, and that wasn't what they needed to do. So they were really working much harder than they needed to. So I work it out with the San Francisco Library to bring in an adult reading program to the facility. We're going to do it 1 hour before the shift starts. I get my boss to agree that we'll actually pay people to be there for that first hour. And I think, this is going to be great. I make these posters, and I'm patting myself on the back when I stick the posters up in the break room, and I'm just so excited to do this adult learning program. Not one person signs up, not even one. Nobody even asked me about it. And I'm thinking, wow, what in the world did I do wrong? And a couple of, maybe a week goes by of 0 takers. And I go and find one of my key supervisors, one of the right-hand men. And I said, why isn't anybody signing up for the reading program? And he looks at me and he said, you're an idiot. First of all, you put a poster up that says, come to the adult reading. They can't read. And I said, oh, geez, I didn't even think that. That is ridiculous. And I said, I got to change that immediately. And he said, well, hold on. Which one of these guys who, some of them are gang members, some of them are just, hard people, and, and they have pride. He said, which one of them is going to raise their hand and say, I can't read? And I thought, oh my God, that's true too. And I had to fold the whole thing up because there was no interest and no opportunity there. Ultimately, a couple of people came to me on the side, and I pointed them in the direction of the library so that they wouldn't have to, stand up in front of everybody else. But that was a huge lesson for me, right? That I had just immediately assumed I'm doing this great thing. Everybody's going to be so happy about it. And it just didn't turn out that way. Again, a few people did take some steps, but I don't think that is credit to me in any way.
Well, what it did is opened your eyes to take into consideration human nature, right?
Exactly.
So your aims were very, very noble, and so you put together a plan that seemed to make sense to you, not understanding what might necessarily make sense to the people who are involved. I think that's a fantastic lesson. All right. So you're there for 11 years, coming back. You don't stay there for your entire career. An opportunity presents itself and you make a move. So why don't you tell us the story behind transitioning out of this role as the director of events in Moscone? You've been there for 11 years and hopping into Olympic Games.
Yeah. It was really peculiar. I knew the Olympics were going to be in Salt Lake, but it just never dawned on me that I should, make the effort to put my name in the hat. And out of the blue, I got a call from Doug Arnott, and he said that I had been recommended by Beth White, who worked for the Olympic Committee, and I knew Beth White because she also worked for the Salt Palace. We worked in this, this little convention circle, and that it was kind of out of the blue. I didn't know Beth that well, and kudos to her making that recommendation, and to Doug calling me. And like I said earlier, when you're in that event world, suddenly somebody asks you to work on this amazing global specter, and how can you say no? And so I took the chance and I moved. I was born and raised in San Francisco. That was the first time I moved away. And obviously I loved it. I'm still here.
Wow. Well, that's a big change. What did they want you to do?
So it was operational planning. So it was, the venue management team. And at that point, I was a big skier and snowboarder, so I had connection to the snow, I guess, but I never really worked in like a FIS event or things like that. And I think that the thing that was probably the biggest draw for Salt Lake was I did have all these written plans. I had training manuals that I'd put together, and event packages that allowed us to set up for these big conventions. And I had set up an entire CAD system with all the different drawings, and taught all of my event management team to use a CAD system so that we had extremely accurate event plans all the time. Um, and so those kinds of things are, as you know, we live and die by those schedules, and by the information, and by our ability to coordinate and communicate with our teammates. And the foundation starts with those plans. So that was, my first introduction, and I was thrust into this Olympic world. And I feel fortunate that I worked with a number of people, like I guess I would call them the legends of games planning in the U.S. People like Doug and Jim Brown and Richard Bessemer and Colin Hilton and yourself, of course, and Darren Hughes and Dave Gustafson. I can go on and on and on, and also all these folks coming from Sydney as well. Adam Gray and Nick Martin, Alan Brooks, and Lou Laurie, all these people who had experience, and they were so willing to share, and that was such an amazing experience for me. And when I think back on that, I can't even fathom the amount of information that these people shared with me. And we all grew through that process as well. So it was a mutual sort of growth and development program here in Salt Lake. And the fact that Mitt Romney and Fraser Bullock supported these efforts throughout the entire process just made it so much easier. And they were there to help us get past the roadblocks, and they were also there to support the crazy initiatives that we put together. And Park City is a great example. Working with Christy Nicolay, we came up with this great idea of putting a full concert in the middle of the venue, in the middle of the competition, and then creating tiered standing room snow tiers so that people could see into the half pipe while that competition was going on. That had never been done before, and they were so supportive, and they just let us go with it. And and again, that goes back to that trust thing, and the willingness to let us experiment. And when it worked, it worked.
Well, I'm really curious how that comes about. You come with your own background, your experience, your expertise coming from an event, but not a sport event environment. Then you've got people coming from Sydney with their Olympic experience. You have people coming from Atlanta, perhaps World Cup '94.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So you have people coming from lots of different places with a lot of different perspectives. If it's not managed right, that could be a disaster, right? Everybody coming in saying, "Well, this is how it should be done." Well, no, this is how we did it over here. So how did you get this all figured out that you could work together because you came from so many different backgrounds and experiences?
I'm going to say that part of it was that we had this amazing organization and amazing group of people that allowed us to leverage so many different skill sets and experiences, and people who weren't afraid to say no. And part of it was I was probably just young and cocky and thought, of course we can do that. I know for a fact that I always said, yes, I'm for everything. And when we decided to go with the tiered snow seating area, everybody was nervous about it, but we did get a chance to test it out. The the year before during our test events, and it seemed like like it was going to work. Obviously, we did it on a much smaller scale, and for the games, we put it on the drawings. We blew snow for 2 months to make that pile, and the resort shaped it into that standing area, and it worked great. Um, Again, I got to give credit to my bosses and the other bosses in the organization, because they did give us that ability to do it. And I think we were very responsible with it. We didn't do everything that we thought we could do. We didn't we never, I mean, for me, of course, safety comes first. We even had guardrails on that in the snow, which was a bizarre aspect of that, but they were actual guardrails, and they met code. Um, well, code-ish, I guess, right? There's not really a code about, if there's a 6-foot drop on a snow ledge, you have to have a guardrail. We kind of adapted deck railing code for that. But again, I think it was just this. It wasn't necessarily just people saying go for it. It was people saying, you know what, I think we can do it, and then we worked through the challenges to establish an argument that said, you know what, we can do this. And in Sydney, I think that they took a lot of those opportunities, and I was amazed. I only went over there to work on the games during the games as part of a secondment program, but it was such an eye-opening experience, and it was such a huge, huge event, and it was inspiring and just absolutely encouraging. And it really did make me think, we can do everything. We can create anything we want. And certain aspects of that they did come true. We did things in Salt Lake that had never been done before. Same thing in Vancouver, and the same thing in Rio, and all subsequent games. I think that's one of the great things about the games environment, and quite frankly, big events environments, is that we are looking for the newest and the coolest, and the more, the more we can increase that customer experience, the better it ultimately turns out to be. And that was one of those key aspects of Salt Lake, right? The customer experience was so important.
So Salt Lake ends. What are you thinking? I go back to San Francisco. I go find another job. What happens when the games are done? And you've wrapped up all your post games reports and taking care of everything, and you're thinking, well, what do I do now?
And like everybody, I was thinking, oh, I'm going to go to Athens, then I'm going to go to Torino, then I'm going to go here, then I'm going to go there. And the reality of that is, these organizations don't just want to be flooded by the operators of the games past. They want to do it themselves. And so I made, I'd say, cursory level efforts to get to either Torino or to Athens. But I got a call from the Salt Palace Convention Center, and they had basically disbanded their event staff for the games, and for like a year, and then they suddenly were faced with a reorganization, and a lot of sort of residual Olympic damages, if you will. And so I got a great opportunity to go work for the Salt Palace, and I did that for about a year, helped them to reorganize their event department. We brought in a new person to be the director of events there. I wasn't interested in being that person at that time. I wanted to have an upward, career, and kudos to that guy, Dan. He's still there now, and he's the general manager of the facility. So, I don't take credit for his upward mobility. I just take credit for mentoring him. I don't actually think that, but It does make you feel good though when people get these promotions and they actually, get to their dream jobs. Um, but that then introduced me to Salt Lake County. Salt Lake County then hired me to take over the Center for the Arts, and I had to do a complete revamp of that. And then I made a questionable career choice, and I got into the political realm, and I worked directly for a mayor, and I loved it because I did get this incredible exposure into the community and working with lots of different facets within Salt Lake County and with other organizations throughout Utah. Um, but it's a harsh climate, especially when you're a political appointee working in a mayor's cabinet, and folks are gunning for you all the time. Um, and I'm a guy that digs holes and fills them up. You point, I dig, and the operational planning is my thing. I I liked being in the community. I liked that process, the communication, and sort of understanding the challenges that we face throughout the community, and that was really my kickstart to working in public health as well. Um, but I wasn't happy in that political environment. And out of the blue, I got a call from Vancouver, from Adam Gray, to come out to Vancouver, and I took that opportunity, and I was very happy to do that. I loved working in Vancouver, and even Canada, right across the border, they have a different perspective and a different way of doing things. And again, I had to keep my mind open and learn, and I loved it.
Let's go to Vancouver then. You had Salt Lake experience, but as you mentioned, not every city is saying, "Hey, everybody that worked previous games, come work for us," because we want to put our own spin on it. We want to do our own thing. So, how did that transition work? You've been doing the non-Olympic stuff for a few years in various capacities with venues, convention centers, working in government. Now coming back into it after being out of it for a few years. What was that transition like?
I was so happy to be back into the games mode, and planning and having venue plans and all these other great things, and we're going to build this and we're going to build that. I gotta say, like I said, I did not expect Canada to be as significantly different from the U.S. as it really turned out to be, and I think I got lucky. Working in that political environment and the constant pressure of that really gave me this opportunity to sit back and say, you know what, I have to listen more. I have to talk less, listen more, find allies and bring people on board, and approach things not from a I know this is best standpoint, but really a we would like to see this happen, and these are the reasons why. And so in Canada, and that's not to say I don't talk too much anyway, I always do, but I think I just had a different approach to it, and a much, I guess, a kinder, gentler Chris. And so that actually helped me in Canada to realize that, wow, they do have a more inclusive perspective, and they did have some really interesting ideas that were being thrown out there, and some of them were kind of challenging, even from an operational standpoint. Some of them were challenging from a sort of that social experiment perspective, and I'm not going to say there weren't some difficulties. The decision making process was much slower than it is in the States, and that sometimes frustrated me, but as I said before, I had to kind of step back and sort of rethink where I was, appreciate where I was, of course. And that's one of those key elements is, I mean, we're planning the most incredible event in the world. We have to appreciate it, even though there are bad days and there are more good days than bad ones. And this is a really amazing opportunity. Um, so I think that what I was able to do was embed myself with, in the organizing committee, really, really work hard to understand those cultural nuances to the best of my knowledge, and never think that I know everything about Canada because I've lived there for 2 months or whatever amount of time, but really just continue learning and learning and learning and changing and adapting as necessary. Absolutely, there were some crazy things that happened. There were some challenges that I thought insurmountable, but ultimately we were able to put all the pieces together. And again, I think that communal aspect of the Canadian culture was was a bit heavy. It was a heavy load to carry, but once we got there, it really worked, and I really appreciate um, the partners and the community that we worked with in Vancouver. I was up in Whistler at the I'm working mostly with the resort community up there, but it was really a good experience for me, and one that I to this day I still utilize those lessons as well. So I just keep booking all these experiences and life lessons, and I use them.
Well, coming back to the beginning, your career really starts with a seismic event in San Francisco, a literal seismic event. But these two organizing committees that you talked about, Salt Lake and Vancouver, were also hit with figurative seismic events. Salt Lake had two of them, which were the bid scandal in 1999, and then you had 9/11, which
Yeah.
happens months before the start of the games. Vancouver gets swallowed up in the world financial crisis, right, which has a significant impact on revenues for the games, and causes a lot of downstream impacts on your planning and so on and so forth. So kind of walk us through how you handled these seismic events. The 9/11 situation,
Mm-hmm.
which happened right before games. Then you have the world financial crisis, which happens about 18 months before games time in Vancouver. You know, how did you and your team, the people that you work with, deal with these incredible challenges?
Yeah. Um, 9/11 obviously was a shock to everybody, and I guess I'd started out with a good personal foundation in that when I was involved in this earthquake, I immediately went out and then started taking FEMA training for disasters and terrorism and all kinds of other uh, bad things, I guess, if you will. And then because our department was based in venues, we had to go through a lot of the security training and with the FBI and the Secret Service. So we had kind of a perspective on secure venues, and obviously we all knew that the Munich Olympics, what the fallout from that was. We also had good experiences and people to kind of coach us along from Atlanta. But when 9/11 hit, that really was a shock to the system. And again, I got to give credit to the Salt Lake Organizing Committee and to the way the United States uh, government, all of the government agencies we worked with, and the state and local police and first response agencies, it gave us this ability to say, you know what, we want to do this thing. We want to prove to the world that we can still host this global stage event, and we can still do it, and we're not going to let these terrorists defeat us. And I think that the approach that we took was a realistic one. We weren't trying to rub anybody's face in it. We were just trying to say, you know what, this is an extremely powerful and unfortunate act of terrorism that happened, but we are going to continue. And that message resonated from Mitt Romney through the entire organization. As I said earlier, Fraser Bullock was always supportive of our efforts in the operational side, and I think that it also gave everybody a great, it really created that familial aspect, and that we had a job to do, a task that all eyes were going to be upon. And we pulled together and we did it. No question, it made it harder. No question, the challenges and the budget issues and the security and the fear was there. But I think that we were able to get past that and deliver what I would consider one of the best Olympic experiences I've ever had. And it didn't feel like a police state. It felt like an Olympic Games, and that was a great thing. Moving on to Vancouver, the budget, it was tough. It was always, from the moment I arrived, it was always a discussion. And then the bottom fell out, and that discussion just became louder and louder and louder. And I recall a couple of times where we actually had IOC COCOMs or other IOC meetings going on, and I was creating and recreating and changing and redeveloping our venue budget 3 times in the week so that we could, kind of put the pieces together. And sometimes money had to be moved from here to go over to another area. And then we would have to rejigger our plans so that we could, still have the experience that we were looking for. And that was a really tough exercise. But again, one that I think, especially when we went to Rio, we realized that having a well-connected financial arm, one that was embedded into the specific venue, all the way down to the venue teams, not just functional areas, but having that close connection is really important. And then other aspects like, for lack of a better term, maybe handshake deals on uses of venues or properties. That's hindsight being 2020. I think that's a huge risk. And one of the things that we've been talking about here with the Utah Olympic Legacy Foundation, as the plans for a new bid come into place, venue use agreements are one of the first things that they started working on, because my discussions with Colin Hilton about that have always revolved around, when we don't have the venue use agreements and we start moving forward with significant planning, we start backing ourselves up into corners. And I think that the host cities are a lot more sophisticated than they used to be, and they're not interested in just hosting the games at all cost, right? They have to be very responsible, and I think that we have to be responsible partners. And again, that financial aspect on the revenue side, but also on the just the general contractual and expectation side has to be front and center. And it definitely makes it could make your life either a nightmare, depending on your negotiation with the other side, or it could make your life so much easier. And I think in general it makes it easier, right? Do it in advance. Absolutely. We're not going to always be able to predict the financial future of the games or of our revenue, our sponsorships, things like that. But if we do have plans and we have, again, that connectivity to our financial planners, we can make it work. And that's exactly what happened in in both Vancouver and Rio. Right, we started seeing revenue issues, so we adjusted accordingly.
I want to come back to the venue use agreements, and in those environments, it's so important to work with all of these stakeholders, right? Whether they're the venue owners, the various public authorities and municipalities,
Right.
The various government agencies, which you talked about with 9/11 and first responders and so on and so forth. So, what are some of the lessons that you learned throughout your experience, really being on both sides of the fence, because you've been on the government side of things, and you've also been on the venue side of things and the organizing committee side of things. So when you look at you have a view from multiple perspectives, right? So what are some of the lessons that you've learned that's helped you to work so effectively with so many different stakeholders? Because they all have their own objectives, right? We all, whether you're a venue owner or an operator, or you're the person responsible for public safety for your county, or you're delivering the event. Everybody has their different overall strategic objectives, but you've got to bring all these folks together to achieve a common goal.
Yeah, and it's difficult. There's no question about it. And I talked about how I hoarded information when I was an intern. Well, that same sort of data collection follows me throughout my career, or maybe it's pushing me. I'm not sure. But being able to actually put together plans that we can back up with what we would consider to be realistic predictions or facts or previous experiences. I think that really goes a long way, and bringing the stakeholders to the table to discuss this openly, not to hide something but to say, what, when we need to transport 20 or 30,000 people into Park City, a city of 8,000 people or 6,000 people, transportation is a real issue. Traffic is a real issue that needs to be managed, and it needs to be managed very carefully. And the same is said for any Olympic venue, right? Lots of people are going to show up and lots of people are going to leave. Sometimes they're going to do it twice a day, and they'll do it for 17 days in a row. There is no city in the world that hosts events for 17 days in a row all at once. And nobody can say, oh yeah, I already did that. But again, bringing those folks to the table, being truthful, being honest about where we stand and what the expectations are, and not leaving meetings saying, well, I thought they were going to pay for that, or right. We have to be very clear and establish the expectations, the boundaries, the level of service that we want to provide, and to be realistic. I mean, gold-plated toilet seats are probably really nice, but I don't think that we need them, right? So we have to, not that we've ever budgeted for gold-plated toilet seats, but there are certain levels of service that are just not achievable, and we have to be very clear about that. We know that inside of the bid documents, everybody is frolicking through the fields, holding hands, and kids will learn lessons beyond your wildest dreams, and everybody will become a gold medalist. And the reality is that we still operate in the environment that we operate, and there are always challenges. And the financial parts of those challenges are absolutely real. But there's also the social and those the social sides of those challenges need to be considered as well. And we have to be empathetic to the needs of the local community, the needs of the athletes, the needs of the visitors and the spectators. And again, we want to create not just a great visitors experience, but a great experience for everybody, especially the people that live and work and have to deal with this thing, this behemoth that's coming in that they may or may not have anything to do with. And being empathetic and being able to reach out to the community. And you'd asked about some challenges, and both Salt Lake, Vancouver, or all three, Salt Lake, Rio, and Vancouver. I had public meetings where we discussed, open houses where we walked through the plans, and people were worried about it, and they were worried about the impacts, and rightfully so. But again, if we approach this with a realistic attitude, and we bring those stakeholders to the table, sometimes they're not helpful, right? There's no question. Not all stakeholders are helpful, but we know that we can leverage and work with those stakeholders, and we can do the best that we can, as opposed to just saying, "Oh, don't worry, it'll be fine." That's rarely effective.
Well, I'm looking down. I'm like, holy cow, we've been going for an hour.
I can go for many more. That's
I know we're
that's
just
why
scratching.
I hoped you would edit it down.
I know we're just scratching the surface on the stories because it's impossible to condense 30 years of career experience and knowledge and learning into a 1 hour conversation. But I do want to touch on Rio a little bit because Vancouver ends. Tell us a little bit about how you ended up getting involved in Rio, and I imagine that would be a challenging transition in some ways as well, because a different way of working down there. And then you've got language on top of that, which you didn't really have to deal with so much when you were working in Salt Lake and Vancouver. So tell us a little bit about that transition from Vancouver down to Rio.
Yeah, it wasn't a direct transition. I came back to Utah, and I worked that's when I wrote all of our plans for the health department and things like that. Obviously, going from the United States to Brazil was a big cultural change. I had been there, I'd vacationed there, and I had a great time. I loved it. But it was definitely a completely new environment, and one that obviously my previous levels of comfort were, I was relegated to a level of comfort in the office that I enjoyed previously. But then the other 3/4 of the day, I had to sort of navigate this new environment that I had never, even as a tourist, you don't experience, everyday life. But again, I just approached it with an open mind, and I quickly discovered that in Brazil they have a different way of working through the projects, and a different timeline. So I had to adapt to the Brazilian timeline. I relied heavily on the people who were on my team to be very honest with me and tell me if I'm making mistakes or if I'm not approaching something correctly. And I do think that the folks who were on my team were great and in being honest with me. And again, I sort of took the lessons from my previous bosses, who gave me those the benefit of the doubt to go out there and plan something extraordinary, even if it was kind of a half-assed plan. But they did a really nice job, and I was there to kind of help guide and focus us, and put us into that planning groove that met with the IOC responsibilities, or the IOC methods and expectations. And I mean, it was definitely difficult to do that, because the IOC does want us to do things in a very specific manner, and that manner doesn't necessarily bend to the Brazilian way of doing things. And I found it fascinating. I loved it. Obviously, if it was frustrating. It was frustrating from a language perspective because I was learning Portuguese, as I went along, and we talked about venue use agreements. Well, how ridiculous is it to think that some gringo can walk in and negotiate this complex contract with a guy who's speaking Portuguese and I don't speak it, right? These are the, that's the traditional role of venue management, and I didn't have the language skills to do that. I could read the contract. I could walk everybody through, and whether the other person spoke English or not, and most people, most of the folks that we were working with did, but again, there's these cultural nuances that were significantly different, and I had to reach out to people in the organization and even folks outside of our organization to really, help us develop those venue use agreements or even plans that would affect communities surrounding venues. And there was a high degree of willingness to help, but not a high degree of experience with those kinds of elements. And ultimately, what I realized was the more effective route to venue use agreements was for me and our legal team to be able to review the venue use agreements, but to have a native speaker and in particular our chief financial officer as the person who really headed up that venue use agreement aspect. And I think that was, as much as we like to check the boxes, I did this and I did that, it's so much more important to do what's right for the organization. Sometimes it's not right. I struggled for a while to try to get it to work, but ultimately, we just had to go to the resources that could do it and get it done, and it was done, and it worked.
So then you finish your time at Rio. Your tenure with Rio is over. Do you come back to Park City and start working for the city right away? When you were doing the work for the city before you went to Rio, were you doing that as a contractor, or were you
Yeah,
employed by the city?
yeah. For Summit County, I was a contractor initially. When I came back, it just happened to be fortuitous timing. Uh, Somebody was leaving the county, the former emergency manager. I stepped into that role. And because I had already worked in the health department, I took on an expanded role as the public health emergency manager and all hazards, so earthquake, fire, killer bees, all of that. Um, and that was a tough thing to do because they're two full-time jobs. Um, and they're two very interesting jobs, right? I learned to become and I got my credential to be my red card for wildland firefighting, but that's a career in and of itself, and it's hard, and that's a job that the people who do wildland firefighting, we should thank them every single day, because that is a harsh environment and they are dedicated. You know, I got my credentials so that I could be at the fire scene doing my emergency management stuff and not be in their way. I mean, that when I think about it, I just didn't want to be in somebody's way. Um, you know, when I came back, I realized that there were a bunch of different, FEMA and CDC have all these requirements for planning elements that need to be delivered. And then every X number of years, you have to review those plans and update them. And then all of a sudden, we got a literally just a nebulous email from the state of Utah, the Department of Health and Human Services, that said, we're tracking this virus It seems to be emanating out of Wuhan, China, and it has the potential to become a global pandemic, much the same as H1N1. And then the rest is history.
Well, if I recall, Chris, the first, I don't know if outbreak is the right term, but the first cases or concentration of cases were there in Summit County, right? We saw there were a few cases that popped up there, and so um, I, it appeared from an outsider's perspective that Summit County was one of the first counties to be impacted by this, and then to respond to it.
Yeah. And, to that point, you're right. Summit County is a ski town, so it's a ski vacation area. So we have lots of people visiting and lots of people from other countries who are just here to work for the season. And so we get a lot of traffic in and out. Our population swells 5 times what it would normally be on the off season. The challenges that we faced immediately were, number one, we couldn't track who was sick or who wasn't sick unless they contacted us, and we didn't have the tools anyway, and so when we started seeing people reporting, going to the hospitals, and then we started seeing these sort of upticks at the hospital, and a lot of those, not everybody was a local. Some people were just visiting, and suddenly they're really sick. And then, all around the state and all around the country, we start seeing this pandemic grow and grow and grow and grow. And even though our numbers were seemingly small comparatively, they were significant to our population base and the resources that we had available. And so our response, and thankfully we had our director of public health and the deputy director were very proactive. They were absolutely just so proactive about getting our plans in place and starting to deliver response, right? Starting to respond to this pandemic, even though we didn't have tools. And so, our first response efforts were communication. Our second response efforts were, do whatever you can to limit your exposure. If you feel ill, you are ill. And, that messaging was really important for us. And to make sure that we understood the differences and the nuances of our populations in Summit County, because we have a ski resort side, and we have a rural side, and a farming side, and a ranching side, and second homeowners and primary homeowners, and everything in between. And so, again, this is typical of public health. We have to understand our audience. We have to really make a very, very specific effort to understand those persons who are at the highest risk. And, for COVID, and it's true even today, the persons who are at the highest risk are the elderly and persons with comorbidities, right? Maybe an additional diabetes or RSV, or, lung cancer or something like that. Like, folks who are at those highest risks need to be focused on. And that's really how all of the COVID planning started to evolve, right? Start with the riskiest populations and work your way down. Again, I think that because we had already started our planning, because we already had that mindset of immediate response, and we had a community that was very willing and helpful in that regard, we were able to implement as fast as possible. And we literally received, when we received our tests, the next day we were testing. When we received the vaccines, the next day we were delivering vaccines. And again, hats off to our volunteers because they went above and beyond. We had people who were volunteering for more than 30 shifts, which is more than people volunteered during the games. And we weren't giving them cool uniforms and uh, tchotchkes and swatch watches and all the swag that goes along with the games. But again, people care about their community, and that's one of those aspects of games planning that if you are not in tune with your community, if you don't know what your community needs or expectations are, you're just going to have an event inside of it doesn't matter where your event is, because if you're isolated, it's not really I think what the Olympics stands for, right? And that is that true flavor of the host city.
Wow. Well, this has been a fantastic now hour and 20 minutes conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. To wrap us up, 2 questions. And the first one is, you were given an opportunity more than 30 years ago to come into this business as an intern, right? And there are people who might be watching this or listening to this who might be looking at events as a potential career choice for them. So what advice would you share to those who are interested in or are just starting out in this crazy event business?
Well, first and foremost, it is hard work. There's no question about it. From the planning to the delivery to the wrap up, it is hard work. So you should be prepared for that. But inside of that hard work, there are thousands of opportunities for you to really feel rewarded, right? And sometimes those rewards are not outward or coming to you from the outside. They're not always your boss saying, "Great job." As event planners, we compartmentalize into these little tiny deliverables and we link them all together, and it ultimately equals a successful games. We can't always claim success for the total event experience, but every step of the way we plan for something, and when we accomplish that, that is an accomplishment. It's an accomplishment that's worth celebrating, either personally or within your team or within your function or within the organization. But everybody contributes, and that, first and foremost, I think that's an aspect that if you can realize that every single person contributes and every person has value, and you're comfortable with your tiny value contribution, you'll do great. You're not always going to be the star of transportation or of logistics, but the rest of those venues couldn't operate without your part in it. And we end up digging a lot of holes and filling them up. We change our mind constantly in these big events, and quite frankly, all the plans that we write are only plans. Once we get to implementation, everything can and will change. And so again, you should be happy with the contributions you make, and you should also be happy to change those, because we can't actually deliver anything unless we're first and foremost prepared to deliver something different than what we thought, because things happen, plans change, humans. Once you introduce humans to the equation, all bets are off. But as long as we can make those changes and be satisfied, right? We can't be married to the plan that we wrote. We have to be married to the plan that we wrote that has the ability to change, to adjust, to adapt to whatever the circumstances are. Long days, long nights, but at the end of the event, you're part of something special, and it is so rewarding and so amazing. And I'll tell you, every single time I've had to give that that final speech to my teams, I've never been able to get through it without getting choked up and having to take a few minutes so that I can regain my composure. But it's because it is that it's something that is emotionally draining and fulfilling at the same time. It's a spectacular thing. Some of these things are once in a lifetime opportunities. How much more could you possibly ask for? It is absolutely fabulous. So
All right,
do it.
Chris. Well, thank you for spending an afternoon of your extremely busy schedule having a conversation with me. I
Didn't you have a
appreciate.
second question?
Oh, this is coming to my second question. My
Okay.
second question is
Sorry.
uh, for people who have been listening to this conversation, they want to learn more about events. They want to understand more about public health and safety. They just want to learn more about those kind of
Mhm.
things. What's the best way for folks to actually reach out and connect with you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, so find me on LinkedIn. You're more than welcome to send me a note, or you can just send me an email through to my work, or my personal email. I don't care. So clcrowley@gmail.com. Obviously, that's my personal, or ccrowley@summitcounty.org. And I started in the event business, and I continued to sort of add my emergency management and CDC credentials to that. And to be honest, I think that the event business is applicable to so many different areas and so many different aspects of our lives. Um, I've never seen any limitations, and like I said, when I have to give credit to the Summit County Health Department, because when I was first hired, I talked to them about Olympic planning. They were talking to me about pandemics, and my boss, he was here for the Olympics, and that light bulb went on, and I could see him when he finally connected those two, and he said, "You know what? We're going to go for this because this makes sense to me. I saw how the Olympics worked, and the pandemic planning. That's what I was trying to draw this link between Olympic planning and pandemic planning, and I saw that light bulb go off above his head, and it did work. And kudos to him for taking that chance. But again, I think that the skills that you build here, and quite frankly, you get this opportunity to work with so many people and so many interesting uh, uh, aspects and tasks, and you get exposed to things that you would never in a million years think you could be, exposed to. There are limitless opportunities. So go for it.
Well, thank you, Chris. I really appreciate it. I personally have had a lot of light bulb moments just in our hour-long conversation here. So thank you for joining us. Listeners, viewers, please like and subscribe to our podcast, and we'll catch you again soon. Thanks so much, Chris.
Great. Thank you, Christian. Appreciate it.